There is a single number, an elevation on the side of a reservoir wall, that decides whether one of the great power plants of the American West keeps running at full strength or loses most of its output in an instant. That number is 1,035. 1,035 feet above sea level. It is the water level in Lake Mead below which the mighty Hoover Dam cannot generate 70% of the power it makes today. Not a gradual decline at all. A cliff. And when the alarm was first raised, the lake sat only about 14 feet above that fateful line. 14 feet on a reservoir that has been steadily dropping for a quarter of a century is almost nothing. It is a summer. It is a bad season. And the people who manage this river now say plainly that crossing that line is no longer a question of if, but of when. The date is coming. This is the story of that number, why it matters so enormously, and what happens on the day the lake finally slips beneath it. Most people have never heard this number, and that is part of what makes it so unsettling. We are used to environmental warnings that feel vague and far away, spread across decades, easy to file under someday. This is the opposite. This is a hard, specific line, a precise elevation that engineers and water managers have known about for years, sitting just below a lake surface that is dropping in plain view, tracked to the inch on public gauges anyone can check online. There is no debate about whether the consequence is real. The machinery guarantees it. There is only the question of exactly which week the water arrives. It is one of the rare moments where a slow-moving crisis sharpens into something you can almost mark on a calendar, and the closer the lake creeps to that line, the more the abstract becomes concrete. And the more a distant worry becomes a dated appointment the entire region is being forced to keep. Let's start with why 1,035 feet is so specific and so deadly, because it is not an arbitrary figure. It comes down to the machinery inside the dam. Hoover Dam has 17 turbines, 17 great spinning generators that turn the force of the Colorado River into electricity. But not all of those turbines are built the same, and here is the crucial fact almost nobody knows. 12 of those 17 turbines simply cannot operate when the water in Lake Mead falls below 1,035 feet. They were not designed for it. Hydroelectric turbines depend on the pressure of the water stacked above them, and below that elevation, the pressure is too weak for those 12 machines to run properly. So when the lake crosses that line, 12 of the dam's 17 turbines effectively go offline, and the plant's generating capacity is slashed by roughly 70% almost overnight. This is not a slow fade. It is a threshold, a trapdoor, and the lake is standing right on top of it. To picture why, imagine the water in Lake Mead as a giant weight pressing down through the dam. Hydropower is nothing more elaborate than that weight of water falling through pipes and shoving against the blades of a turbine, spinning it like a pinwheel in a stream. The higher the lake, the taller the column of water, the harder it pushes, and the more electricity each turbine can make. As the lake falls, that push weakens for every turbine at once. Most of Hoover's machines were built for a full or near full reservoir, tuned to a world where Lake Mead stood hundreds of feet higher than it does today. They can tolerate a drop, but only so far. Below 1,035 feet, the column of water above 12 of them is simply too short to spin them efficiently or safely, and they must be shut down. Only 5 specially capable turbines can keep turning in that thin, low-pressure water. So the 70% figure is not an estimate of some vague future decline. It is a hard mechanical fact baked into the steel and concrete of the dam itself, decided decades ago by the engineers who chose which turbines to install and how low they could go. The lake is now falling toward the exact elevation where 2/3 of the plant's heart stops beating. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because most people imagine a drying reservoir as a slow, gentle decline, a little less water, a little less power, year by year. And for a long time, that is exactly how it went. Hoover Dam already produces something like 40 to 50% less power than it did back in the year 2000, when Lake Mead was full. A slow erosion as the lake dropped foot by foot over 2 decades. But the line at 1,035 feet is different. It is not a gentle slope. it is a step off a ledge. Above it, the dam limps along at reduced but substantial output. Below it, most of the machinery goes dark all at once. That is why water managers have circled this specific elevation, why they have been warning about it for years, and why 14 feet of remaining margin is so alarming. The decline that was gradual is about to become sudden. So where is the lake now, and when does it cross the line? This is where the story stops being a hypothetical and becomes a countdown. When the warning went out, Lake Mead was hovering around 1,049 feet, roughly 14 to 15 feet above the critical threshold, and falling. Through the brutal heat of the summer, it kept dropping, closing that gap week by week. The federal agency that manages the river released a detailed 2-year forecast, and the projection is stark. The models show Lake Mead continuing to fall, sliding toward and then past the 1,030 5-foot line, with official forecasts putting the lake below that elevation within roughly a year, some scenarios as soon as late summer, others by the following spring. The same forecast shows the lake dropping further still in the years after, toward levels never seen since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s. When water managers say the date is coming, they are not being dramatic. They are reading their own charts, and the charts all point downward, through the line, and beyond it. What makes the forecast even more unnerving is the shape of the decline, because a reservoir does not empty at a steady pace. Lake Mead sits in a basin that narrows as it deepens, so as the water gets lower, each additional foot of drop represents less and less water. In practical terms, that means the lake can fall faster the lower it gets, the decline quietly accelerating just as it approaches the most dangerous thresholds. So even the modest 14-foot cushion that existed when the alarm sounded is a softer number than it looks, a margin that can erode not just steadily, but with gathering speed, especially across the blistering evaporation of a record-hot summer. And there is a cruel twist that is speeding the whole thing up, one that ties Lake Mead's fate to its sister reservoir upstream. Above Lake Mead sits Lake Powell, held back by the Glen Canyon Dam, and Powell is in even more precarious shape, dangerously close to losing its own power generation. To protect Powell, federal managers made a decision. They cut back the amount of water released from Powell down into Mead, holding more water upstream to keep the higher dam alive. But every gallon held back to save Powell is a gallon that does not arrive at Mead. So the effort to protect the upstream reservoir has actually hastened the decline of the downstream one, pushing Lake Mead toward its power cliff faster than it would have fallen on its own. The two great reservoirs are so intertwined that saving one accelerates the crisis at the other. It is a grim illustration of a system with no slack left, where every move to plug one leak opens another. Now let's talk about what that 70% actually means, because the scale of it is easy to underestimate. Hoover Dam is the largest hydropower plant in the entire Colorado River Basin. Its electricity is not just abundant, it is special in 3 ways that make it extraordinarily hard to replace. First, it is cheap, because once the dam exists, falling water costs almost nothing. Second, it is clean, producing no carbon and no smoke. And third, and most importantly, it is flexible, able to ramp up and down in minutes to match the minute-by-minute swings in electricity demand across the grid. That last quality is worth its weight in gold. When a heat wave hits and millions of air conditioners switch on at once, a hydroelectric dam can answer that surge almost instantly, which makes Hoover not just a power source, but a stabilizer for the entire regional grid. Lose 70% of that suddenly, and you are not just losing electricity. You are losing one of the most responsive, valuable tools the Western grid has, at a stroke. And there is a dark irony in what replaces it. When Hoover's clean, carbon-free power vanishes. The utilities that relied on it do not simply do without, they buy replacement power on the open market, and a large share of that replacement is generated by burning fossil fuels. So the day the lake crosses the line, the region's carbon emissions tick upward as gas plants fire up to fill the gap. And those emissions feed, in their own small way, the warming climate that is drying the Colorado River Basin, shrinking the snowpack, and draining the very reservoir whose falling level killed the clean power in the first place. The failure makes worse the exact problem that caused the failure. A dam that once offered a clean answer to the region's energy needs becomes, the moment its power fades, a reason to burn more of the fuels that are helping to empty it. It is a small, vicious loop, and crossing 1,035 feet is what sets it spinning. And the loss does not fall on some abstract entity. It falls on real people, and it falls hardest on those with the least cushion. Consider a small rural power district north of Las Vegas that serves only a few thousand people and gets around 70% of its electricity from Hoover Dam. For a community like that, this is not an inconvenience. It is an existential budget problem. When the dam's output is slashed, that district has to go out into the open power market and buy replacement electricity at prices that can swing wildly and that spike highest exactly when demand is highest. On the hottest days of summer, a small district with a few thousand customers does not have the buying power or the reserves of a giant utility. So the manager of a place like that spends his days forecasting, hedging, locking in power purchases a year in advance, and bracing, in his own words, for the day the bottom falls out of the market. Multiply that anxiety across every small town, every irrigation district, every tribal community, and every one of the 10 or so Southern California cities that draw on Hoover power, and you begin to see the true footprint of that single number. And it is worth dwelling on the unfairness of who absorbs the blow, because it follows a pattern this whole crisis repeats. The giant utilities, the big city power companies, with millions of customers and deep financial reserves, can weather a shock like this. They have teams of traders, diverse portfolios of power sources, and the sheer size to spread the cost thin across a vast customer base. But the small players, the rural cooperatives, the tribal utilities, the tiny municipal districts, have none of that. For them, cheap Hoover power was not one option among many. It was the foundation their entire budget was built on. When it is slashed by 70%, they face the same volatile market as the giants, but with a fraction of the resources to survive it. The result is that a family in a small desert town, far from any city, can end up paying noticeably more to run their air conditioning through a lethal summer, not because of anything they did, but because a reservoir dropped below a line on a wall 100 miles away. The people with the least margin feel the sharpest edge of that number first. It is a quiet redistribution of hardship, flowing downhill toward those least able to bear it. There is a particularly sharp irony hidden in who else depends on this power, and it ties the electricity crisis directly back to water. One of the single largest users of Hoover Dam's electricity is a giant Southern California water agency, which uses that power for one specific job, pumping Colorado River water uphill across the desert to the Los Angeles area. The dam's own electricity is what moves the dam's own water to the cities that need it. So when the power output is cut by 70%, it does not just raise electricity bills. It raises the cost of moving the water itself. The very act of delivering Colorado River water to millions of Californians gets more expensive because the cheap power that pushed it through the pipes is fading. Water and power on this river were never two separate problems. They are one problem, braided together, and the line at 1,035 feet is where that braid begins to fray. The grid operators are taking this seriously enough that they are literally running simulations of the disaster. Engineers who manage the reliability of the Western power grid have begun modeling what happens when you effectively switch Hoover Dam off, feeding different weather, demand, and generation scenarios into their computers to see how the grid responds. They are especially worried about what they call compound events, the possibility of losing Hoover's capacity at the same moment as a brutal heat wave, or a wildfire taking down transmission lines, or another plant going offline all at once. On a normal day, the grid can absorb the loss, but the whole point of these simulations is that the dangerous days are not normal days. They are the extreme days, and those are precisely the days when the lake is lowest, the dam is weakest, and the demand for power is highest. The 70% cliff is most likely to bite at the exact moment the grid can least afford it. Now, it is not all helplessness, and honesty requires saying so. There is a plan to soften the blow, though it is a race against the falling water. The federal government has committed tens of millions of dollars to install a small number of new specially designed turbines, so-called wide-head turbines, engineered to keep generating power at much lower water levels, down toward the elevations where the old machines fail, if those new turbines are installed in time. The projected loss when the lake crosses the line would shrink from around 70% to something closer to 60%. That is a meaningful improvement, a real cushion. But notice the catch. It is still a massive loss, just a slightly less catastrophic one, and it depends entirely on getting the new machinery in place before the water falls past the point of no return. It is a patch, a way to buy time and soften the landing, not a cure. The fundamental problem, a reservoir dropping below the level its power plant needs, remains. Step back, and you see why this one number, 1,035 feet, is the most important early warning signal on the entire river. For years, the great fear has been dead pool, the far lower elevation at which no water at all can pass through the dam, and the taps of the desert cities finally run dry. But dead pool is still a long way down. The power cliff is much higher, much closer, and it is the first hard threshold the system actually crosses. It is the canary in the coal mine, the first alarm to sound. The moment the abstract crisis of a shrinking river becomes a concrete, measurable, dated event with immediate consequences. The lights dim, in effect, long before the water stops, and the crossing of that power line is the clearest possible proof that the slow-motion decline everyone has been warned about for decades has finally reached the stage of real, tangible loss. It is worth pausing on the timing, because it makes this moment especially fraught. The entire set of rules that governs how the Colorado River is shared, how much water each state draws, how the reservoirs are operated, is set to expire, and the 7 states that depend on the river have struggled to agree on what replaces it. So the lake is approaching its power cliff at the very same moment that the legal framework holding the whole system together is in flux. Decisions made in negotiating rooms about how much water to release and when will directly affect how fast Lake Mead falls and how soon it crosses that line. The number on the reservoir wall and the words in the legal agreements are connected. 1,035 feet is not just a hydrological threshold. It is a deadline pressing on a political negotiation that has no guaranteed happy ending. So what should you take from all of this? Not panic, but a clear-eyed understanding of how these systems actually fail. They do not fail all at once, in a single dramatic collapse. They fail at thresholds, at specific numbers, quietly crossed, each one triggering a cascade of consequences. 1,035 feet is the first big one. When the lake slips beneath it, there will be no flood, no blackout, no single cinematic moment. There will be a sudden, sharp reduction in one of the West's most valuable sources of clean power. Higher bills rippling out to millions of people, a more fragile grid on the hottest days, a higher cost to move the region's water, and a small army of utility managers scrambling to fill the gap. It will be, in a word, expensive and quiet and profound. And it will be a preview of the deeper thresholds still waiting further down the reservoir wall. The most sobering part is how precise the warning is. This is not a vague prophecy about some distant future. It is a specific elevation on a specific reservoir with a specific consequence, and a lake that is only a handful of feet away and falling. Water managers know the number. They know the machinery. They know the forecast. They have circled the date on the calendar, even if they cannot name it exactly. There is almost no uncertainty about the destination, only about the precise day of arrival. In a world full of ambiguous warnings that are easy to dismiss, this one is chillingly concrete. A great dam, a falling lake, 14 feet of margin when the alarm rang, and a 70% loss of power waiting at the bottom of that short final drop. And here is the last, and perhaps the only, note of hope. Because the warning is so precise, so measurable, so visible on a public gauge that anyone can watch, it is also the kind of crisis that can still be answered. the lake has not crossed the line yet. Every foot of water still standing above 1,035 feet is a foot of time, a chance to use less, to release more wisely, to install the new turbines, to reach the agreement that keeps the reservoir from falling faster than it must. The date is coming, yes, but dates that are seen clearly, far enough ahead, are dates that can sometimes be pushed back, or prepared for, or robbed of their worst consequences. The number on the wall of Lake Mead is a warning written in the plainest possible terms, and the people living below that dam still have, for a little while longer, the power to decide what it means when the water finally reaches it. The turbines are still turning today, the power still cheap and clean and flowing. The line has not been crossed, but it is 14 feet below a falling lake in a warming desert, and every day the gap grows narrower. The date is coming. The only question left is what the West chooses to do before it arrives.